Today we have a real treat in the studio, Casey Baugh. So I'll give a quick bio on Casey and then we'll jump into this. So Casey is an active investor, operator, board member, and advisor. During his 13-year tenure at Vivint, Casey played a critical role in helping grow revenue from 30 million to over $1 billion and leading to a controlled investment by Blackstone and successfully taking the company public. Casey's currently the co-founder and managing partner of Sandlot Partners, a private investment firm which has deployed over 350 million since inception. Casey is regularly sought out by young professionals and students for his ability to mentor and enjoys teaching entrepreneurship, and as an adjunct professor at BYU to undergrad students. So with that, welcome in.
No, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, of course, man. So the first...
congrats on the success on your show.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we're getting after it, man. It's been a lot of fun, and having guests like yourself helps a ton. So thank you again for making the time. Usually first question I ask my guests is talk a little about your upbringing and, what should listeners understand about your childhood years, high school, to kind of get an understanding of how that helped you to become who you are today.
Yeah, I actually think about this a lot because, maybe I turned 40 this year. So you start getting reflective and you start saying, kind of what have I done? Where am I going? What does the future years look like? And the other one that throws me, and I don't know why it does, but like you look at young people that die and you're like, I see a lot of people my age that are at the peak of their career that pass too soon. Whether it's a Kobe Bryant or whether it's, I can't remember the guy. What's the guy's name? Who's Black Panther star?
Was it Chad something? Belswick? I can't remember.
I mean, he was a legend. Like he was in the prime of his life and then he's gone. And so for me, I look back, I grew up in Logan, one of 7 kids. I'm number 5. And so I think, typically what you'd see like with the young kid, like, and my mom went back to work when I was in 3rd or 4th grade.
Okay.
And so it was kind of, I think about how independent I was as a young kid, and me having 5 kids now, I look back and I'm like, we're a lot harder on the first kid than the 5th kid. The 5th kid's like kind of do whatever you want. But, for the first kids, you're running them like a business, and I just didn't have that. I had a lot of freedom to run. Life was pretty small. Like the first time I flew on an airplane, I was 17 years old.
Okay, yeah.
And so life consisted of sports and, my friends and girlfriend and just kind of every, an hour radius of Logan was kind of as big as life got. And so, I think about my dad, what's magic about my dad. He's just, one, he leads with his heart and got really, really big heart. You won't find anybody that doesn't love my dad. But he's also a big dreamer. And I think, Logan, for all the good, it's a small town.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can't expand the dreams out of that small town. Where my mom is very, very different. My mom is extremely practical, extremely frugal. She's one of 14 kids from a family in Afton, Wyoming. And so, what I got from my dad is dreaming big and kind of leading from my heart, where from my mom, it's, get out and grind and be consistent and show up every day and work hard. And I think the combination of the two was, such a gift as I've kind of gone into life and tried to pursue my dreams is, knowing that you kind of have to have the mix of both. You have to have the mix of, dream big and lead with your heart and follow your heart, but also you got to show up every day and go to work. And so that was kind of my upbringing. I came down to Utah County to play baseball at UVU. I'd played for a little school in Montana before church mission.
Okay.
And ended up not being very good at baseball and, got cut from the baseball team and started a career in the door-to-door sales industry. Started with a small company and then ended up with Vivint. And it was just kind of a special run. I never would have anticipated being in that industry, had no desire to be in that industry. And it ended up being like this special, pretty big chapter of my life, so many friendships, so many experiences, and kind of all the stuff I'm doing today. There's no way I could have done any of it if I wouldn't have had kind of that experience. And so,
so how did you get into the sales, summer sales world? I mean, you went.
It was out of necessity. I had a friend in high school. even younger, kid named Doug Robinson, that he was exceptional athlete, you know, good leader. It wasn't surprising at all that he was successful. And, you know, he was a year older than me. And so he had gone out and he'd done it and he'd seen success. And so when I came home, you know, again, you look back and you say, hey, what are the blessings that I had? One of the biggest gifts was that my parents didn't have a lot of surplus capital. Mm-hmm. And so they couldn't pay for my school. So I had to go figure it out. I had to become independent pretty quick. And so that necessity led to knocking doors. It just, you know, paying for school, it was either I paid for it. I was too dumb to realize that you could get loans back then. I just, you know, sure, I didn't have that context that like you could just go get a loan and, you know, live off the loan. And so it was kind of, we grew up, it's like you pay for stuff. And so, went out and knocked doors. I had kind of a friend who was a mentor who led the way, and I kind of looked at what he had done, and I'm also competitive. So I'm like, if he can do it, I can do it. Mm-hmm. And I actually think that mentality's served me really well in life to, you know, just have a simple, if somebody else is doing it, then I can do it. You know, mentality, kind of a can-do philosophy on life. Yeah,
that's super powerful. And I felt the same way within real estate, and just, seeing other people who either you grew up with and seeing them have success, and just saying if they can do it, and not to knock on anybody else, right? But knowing your own abilities or your education, like if that person can do it, certainly I can do it. Yeah. And it just takes the right steps, the right goals, the right actions to get there.
You got to have faith, and you got to have kind of light at the end of the tunnel. And you know, so much of that has to do with having a mentor, having a guide, or having somebody that's blazed the trail. Yeah. You know, and I think living in 2023, we have just so much evidence in all aspects that are important of life, of people that are doing it kind of the way that we aspire to go do it.
Yeah.
And, you know, he was that for me when I got into it. He was, you know, a good buddy that had gone before and had kind of blazed the trail, and it gave me the confidence to start down that road. And again, it, you know, never had any intention other than doing it for a summer, and you can only build on success. And I had success, and so I had a foundation to go build on it. And, you know, I look back, and it was a crossroads that I didn't even know it was a crossroads.
Yeah.
But it led me on a path that was just a way different path than I ever would have chose. And it turned out to be like the perfect path for me.
Yeah.
You know, it sharpened, you know, and developed some skills that were probably there already, but they went through the refiner's fire and became real strengths in my life.
When you started, so you mentioned you started with a smaller company and then transitioned to Vivint. So what year was that when you started with Vivint? And was that
started in 2004?
Okay.
Worked with that company. It was called Atlas Marketing.
Okay.
And that company went out of business in 2007. During the kind of economic downturn, they got caught in that shift, and you know, the company and all the sales reps were a casualty of that, and it was the greatest thing that happened in my career. You know, because of that event, I lost all the money that I'd made the previous 3 years, which again created a bit of a crisis.
Yeah.
And then it also forced me to go look at other options. And in that process, I looked at kind of all the options in the industry and settled on Apex at the time, which was a younger company, but was as mature as there was in the industry. And I started working with, you know, a guy who's become, you know, special in my life, a guy named Todd Peterson.
Sure, yeah.
Who, you know, at 24 years old, to have a front row seat and to be able to learn from what I feel is the best entrepreneur that I've ever known. You know, in my lifetime, it was just, you know, it truly was like a gift from God. I just had a front row seat to be able to watch this guy go build a company, go make leadership decisions, go, you know, have a model on how to treat people, how to treat your spouse, how to give back to the community, how to invest your money. Yeah. I just got to go watch him for 15 years, you know, and it's influenced me so much, you know, over those years. So many of the things that I do and so many of the practices have to do with just, you know, trying to emulate what I feel is, you know, exceptional model of, you know, somebody that's living kind of a purposeful, meaningful, impactful life.
Yeah.
And it never would have happened if the company wouldn't have gone bankrupt. And
sure.
So it's, you know, that blows my mind, even just thinking about like these coincidences that take place that you have nothing to do with. And they're actually the opposite of what you would have wished for or hoped for. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
If I would have got what I wanted, that would have been like the last thing on the list.
Yep.
And the same thing with baseball. You know, at that point in my life, baseball was everything to me. You know, so much of my identity revolved around being an athlete. Mm-hmm. And, you know, when that kind of got blown up and your bubble gets popped and you realize you're not as good as, you know, your dad told you were growing up.
Yeah.
And you kind of realize, you know, I gotta go recreate myself. But I never, you know, what I wanted was to go play pro baseball. What I got was get cut early enough that I don't go invest 3, 4, 5, 7 years on a track that was never gonna pan out for me. It was never in the cards. And I was able to make the adjustment early and move on to something else that I could be, you know, world class at.
Yeah, and that's so true. And it always seems to be in hindsight where, you know, it takes a little bit of time to understand that what had happened at that time that may have seemed detrimental or unfortunate, it was a blessing.
It's exactly what you needed.
Or what you needed. Yep. Yeah. So that's great. So when you started with Apex, which then became Vivint eventually, right? Yep. How many people were there?
It was a big organization. You know, there's thousands of people that worked there.
Oh, really?
You know?
Okay.
Yeah, it was a big sales force, probably 3,000 plus salespeople.
Got it.
You know, they were doing 100 plus thousand accounts a year in the door-to-door program. So they weren't a small company. They were early in taking institutional money. Mm-hmm. I think they'd just taken money from Goldman Sachs and Jupiter. And so even though they were kind of they'd been around for 15 years, you know, Todd had done pest control and he'd done a number of other companies and done alarms for 6-7 years. And so, yeah, they were the opposite of a startup. You look at it today and they'd be an ancient company. You know, you think about your business and starting your business and, you know, 15 years from now, that's a long time.
Right.
But they were at a new phase of growth in the company. They went from being kind of a good small business to we're going to go try to build a big business.
Got it. That makes sense.
And so like it was fertile soil, you know, for somebody like myself that was ambitious to be able to step in at that point in time.
Yep.
You know, and if I would have came 2 years earlier, 4 years earlier, the opportunity wouldn't have been the same. The company wouldn't have been mature enough. It wouldn't have had the foundation. It wouldn't have had the financial wherewithal to be able to support the growth that it had over the next couple of years.
Got it. So yeah, walk us through kind of your tenure there at Vivint, 13, 14 years. Was it mostly sales early on and then transitioned to more leadership? How did that play out?
It was kind of always leadership and always sales.
Okay.
Started off managing a team.
Okay.
And then you know, in that industry, you kind of grow into roles based on performance. And so we grew into a regional role and then a vice president role and ultimately ended up as kind of a senior vice president of sales at the company. And you know, just was able to, even though it was predominantly revenue focused, we were, you know, Todd prioritizes revenue and sales in a big way, which is different than a lot of companies. You know, the CEO, the way the CEO sees the world is kind of the way the company sees the world. You see a big difference. You know, if somebody's engineering focused, kind of, they have an engineering culture. If somebody has a design focus, it's a design culture. And for Todd, you know, sales and revenue was the culture of the business. And so because of that, we, you know, for the sales leaders, we got included in meetings that I don't think a lot of other companies we would have been included in. And so we were able to, you know, build an equipment business and go sell it off in 2 gig. We were able to, and I remember going to New York and being able to sit in meetings where we're raising publicly traded debt, you know, and securitizing our debt and doing these different offerings and being on the floor at the New York Stock Exchange when we split off, you know, our solar company and took it public, or, you know, having failed transactions where, you know, big, you know, M&A activity didn't like right to the 1 yard line and not working out, and how that affected culture to ultimately, you know, going public through a SPAC, which, you know, at that time was a new vehicle. And, you know, and so all those like finance experiences, it's like you couldn't dream of saying like, hey, will I get this experience when I start knocking doors? Right.
You know,
it was just, it was an emergent opportunity. And in my experience, that's just how life has worked. You know, so many of the biggest opportunities, they weren't planned, they weren't deliberate. I was on a track going a different direction, and then something popped up that was better, and I was able to pivot and didn't get too stuck in my plan, but I was able to see like, hey, this is better than my previous plan.
Yeah, I think to that point, most of the people that I've sat down with and done the show with have talked about the importance of pivoting in entrepreneurship.
Yep.
And, you know, having eyes wide open in your current role. Where could things be improved? How could I make something better? How could I pivot? How could I change? And when you're hitting a wall, just having that flexibility to do that.
There's a book that I just revere, and the leader, you know, the guy who wrote the book, same thing. It's called How You Measure Life. It's by Clayton Christensen.
Great book.
And he, you know, he's famous for his theory on disruptive innovation. You know, ended up, you know, doing his doctoral thesis on this theory of disruption. And he kind of was in the age of computing and microchips, and was able to, you know, be very influential on kind of the thinking of technology companies in the kind of 90s and 2000s. But he has kind of this theory of, you have your deliberate strategy, which is, this is what we, you know, this is our plan. And I'm like fanatical about planning. And so I'm, you know, I think it's really, really important to plan and to take action and start moving. Then he talks about these emergent opportunities, and you have to kind of always check the temperature and say, is the direction that I'm going the best direction? But I think the only way that you can get there is just being in motion. You don't get there being static. You don't be there sitting around. You get there kind of as you're charging down the road, and then something else pops up that's better. Yeah,
agreed 100%. That great point. So tell us about your ultimate exit from Vivint. So what was the catalyst to saying, hey, you know, I've had a great experience here. I want to move on to do something. Was it the sale? Was it some liquidity event for you?
Yeah, it was liquidity. I had equity in the company. I had personally invested a significant amount of equity or capital. So I was both an investor and I had sweat equity, both before Blackstone and then after Blackstone came in. And so I think there was always kind of a natural exit on the tail end of, you know, when they went public or when they sold or whatever it was. And it was always, you know, that I was going to be there until that date. I think what I didn't know that I learned along the way was that I don't want to spend my life in a big organization. And I never want to be an employee. And that, you know, I didn't know that about myself. You know, when I was at Vivint and the company was starting to grow, I would look at, you know, kind of the ladder, the corporate ladder, and say, hey, how high can I climb?
Yeah.
And, you know, there was a point along the way where I realized I've climbed as high as I can climb. You know, and the actual corporate role, you know, whether it be a chief revenue officer, or a president, or, you know, a CEO, that you know, probably wasn't going to be in the cards for me at Vivint, and that I didn't want it to be in the cards for me. The people in those roles were great. They were built for those roles, and I probably wasn't built for that role. And so it was just kind of an insight saying that I want to go spend my time in stuff that's more early stage. Yeah. That I want to spend my time investing, that if I am operating, I want it to be a startup culture, that I want it to be in the building. That's what gives me the most energy and excitement. And so I think it was really natural. Todd and Alex, I give those guys so much credit. You know, they're two of the best leaders that I've ever known. And to this day, you know, they're close mentors and friends. But they allowed me to exit in a way that I could go pursue my dreams. And also, you know, I didn't need to go compete with my friends, which you see so much in that industry. You know, people get this specialized skill set, and then the next thing that they do is they got to go like start their own company. Yeah, because that's where, you know, they just have this specialized skill set. And I was able to transition and kind of move on to, you know, other things. And it was gift, you know, to this day, I'm super grateful that, you know, it worked out the way that it worked out. It worked out exactly how I could have dreamed that I could leave, where, you know, I'm just cheering for my friends. Yeah. And I get to celebrate their successes.
Right.
And, you know, I didn't go destroy any value that I created along the way, which was important to me.
Yeah. Did you ever think about starting, you know, pest control or sales or,
Yeah,
you know, like,
I think you think about it every year, you know. You always look out the window and the grass is greener and you see people doing it. And, you know, anytime you deal with something that frustrates you, you look out the window and say, oh, it'd be a lot easier if I was just doing my own thing, which isn't true. You know, every marriage, you know, has its struggles that you work through. Every business has its struggles that you work through. And you kind of look at everything from the outside and say everything's peachy.
Yeah.
But the reality is, you know, being a founder, being a CEO is extremely hard. Building a business is extremely hard. And I think the leadership at Vivint did and is doing a phenomenal job, you know.
Yeah.
And so I looked at it a number of times. I think the relationship with the founders was the reason that I didn't do it along the way. And just forethought on their end. They really created great alignment with all of the sales leaders where, you know, their equity pool that they put in place was as broad as anything I've ever seen in any company.
That's great.
So there was a, you know, massive amount of people, hundreds of people that got 6-figure outcomes when Vivint Solar sold, when Vivint went public. And you don't see that. A lot of companies, they keep all the equity tight. They don't share it. And you've got 1 or 2 founders that make a mint and everybody else is kind of soldiers in the army that, you know, don't get much from it. And so I always respected these guys so much for being generous. And it served them really well because instead of people going and competing, they had ownership of the company and they acted like owners, you know, even if it's a small percentage.
Yeah. Amen to that. And I've seen that in the roles that I've been in the companies, you know, JP Morgan, some of these other groups, it's tough to share the pot. Right. And just really the way that it's structured, it's really hard. But if you have the ability to, if you're a founder, CEO, to incentivize employees with equity and ownership, it, like you said, it creates loyalty. It creates, faithful employees who want to help grow that business and everybody, all the boats rise with the tides at that point, 100%. Right? And so super important point. And then your other point, starting a company is really hard. When I was in my other roles, you look out the window, you're like, I could do this so much better. But then now you're in the seat, it's like those guys were really smart, who I was working for, and they were doing a great job.
I remember going on my mission, and my senior companion, it's so easy to like critique everything.
Sure.
And my senior companion is this kid named Elder Davis. That was I actually haven't seen him in like 20 years, but he was an absolute rock star.
Yeah.
You couldn't have had a better model on somebody that was just loving life, working hard, showing up every day, being consistent. Mm-hmm. But even with that, as a young missionary, I remember like kind of picking him apart and saying, oh, he's not doing this. And it takes actually being a leader when you look back and you say, oh man, he was pretty good.
Yeah.
And I'm screwing it up. Or being a parent and you look back at your parents and be like, they actually did a really good job.
Exactly.
I was probably too hard on them, and I was probably a really tough kid, to be a parent to. And so, I think hindsight, is really good medicine for like, gratitude and perspective. And my spiritual belief is that's why we're here on earth.
Yeah.
Is to go have those experiences to, learn and grow. And the only way to figure out how to be a parent is to be a parent. The only way to how to truly know how to be an entrepreneur is to start a business. You're not going to learn it in class. You're going to learn it in the doing. You're going to learn it in the stress of figuring out how to make payroll and, dealing with a complicated issue. And, that stuff can't be taught. You just have to live it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. So you leave Vivint. Sounds like you had some liquidity. What was the next step for you?
I've just always been an investor. From one of the magics of door-to-door sales is that you make a lot of money up front without any liability. When you're working at a company, you don't, your name's not on leases. You don't have kind of any of the owner's liability that owners carry, but you get kind of all the upside. And I had that for my whole career. I was making 7 figures plus for the last 15, 16, 17 years.
Yeah. Wow.
And so with that, you become an investor. Naturally, you get capital, and then you got to figure out, hey, how to, minimize my tax burden legally. You got to go figure out how to go get diversification and what's my strategy going to be. And so, over the course of 15 years, and I had really good models and mentors. I look at Todd, and he's the best personal investor that I've ever met. He's just incredible. He has a nose for finding value, and he just has a way to invest in companies where he has a lot of value. And so being able to be in that mindset and to be able to study and learn over the years. And so that's what I wanted to go do professionally, and kind of got the opportunity to, we started a manufactured housing company. Jeff Mendez and Jeff Bennett, they had started buying trailer parks.
Okay.
And they, came to me and my partner Baugh, and they said, hey, we want to do this bigger. And so we put in our capital, and we started buying more of them. And then it got a little bit bigger than we were probably comfortable with. And so we went and partnered with Colmena and Lance and Jonathan and Brian Shelley and my buddy Brian Stevenson and the Wadsworth family.
Yeah, yeah.
And we ended up building like this company. It was a pretty big company. We bought, a couple hundred mobile home parks, and then we ended up kind of getting approached or getting connected to Dallas Tanner, who's the CEO of Invitation Homes. Really cool kind of entrepreneurship story of they rolled up 80,000 residential homes from 2009 to today. And
wow.
He's CEO of this publicly traded REIT that's kind of a $30 billion plus REIT.
Yeah.
But they also had a manufactured housing company called Treehouse, and they were in 4 and 5 star communities. So they were in kind of the high end, and their main LPs were institutional LPs.
Sure.
And ours were tertiary markets, middle of the country, more value add.
Mm-hmm.
And when you put the map on paper, it was like our company fit right in the middle of their map.
Got it.
Went from focusing on 2 to 3.5 star to all the way up to 5 star. And it was just kind of an obvious fit that, hey, we either have to go upstream and build capabilities to do 4 and 5 star communities, or these guys are going to have to come downstream and figure out how to do, the more value add communities and find different sources of capital.
Yeah.
And through that process, we merged our companies. And so we have that company now. It's we own over 300 mobile home parks. We own over 40,000 pads and have, big institutional LPs, Utah's pension fund and Blackstone and, Quadrail, a big, Canadian pension fund, and so Artemis, so we have these big institutional LPs, but you also have high net worths. And that was the first time where we got experience in raising money through funds.
Sure.
We did an opportunity zone fund to try to take advantage of some of that new, legislation that came out on opportunity zones. That manufactured housing was like a really good fit for that legislation. Mm-hmm. And then we did a second fund for parks that fell outside of those boundaries. And so through that process, we learned how to raise capital and to do funds and reporting and those things. And so as the company got bigger, and my role, in it diminished. Like I was kind of a player coach for a while. Mm-hmm. And now we have like this world-class management team that they don't want us to help. They just want us to kind of get out of the way.
Yeah.
And sit on the board and, kind of help when we're asked to be helped.
Yeah.
And so it freed up my time. And so, ended up again, randomly, I had a buddy named Dave Jensen. He'd worked back east and done private equity, for most of his career. And he wanted to start a company. And so he asked me to go start one with him. And we kind of do the same thing that he has done his whole career, which is underwrite managers. He worked for portfolio advisors and he worked for common fund capital, and they would just underwrite, the kind of endless number of sponsors. Yeah. And you'd go figure out who's good and who's not, who has above market returns and who doesn't. And they would do this for, pensions, endowments, foundations, kind of high end institutional clients. And we just had this insight where like, there's a need for that solution for high net worth and family offices and RIAs. They're an underserved client. And so we just kind of said, let's go do what you did back east.
Yep.
And also what I did with Roots, which is, have relationships with kind of top 1% founders of companies and high net worths and family offices and registered investment advisors. And let's go connect them with world-class operators and world-class kind of private equity opportunities that they just wouldn't have access to.
Sure.
And so that's kind of what we've done with Sandlot. And it's turned into, real fun, cool business that we're building right now. But it's kind of the outcome of 20 years of Dave's experience and my experience and trying to innovate and bring them together and say, is there a space that exists that's different than what you did and what I did, that there's a need in the market? And, there's just really big product market fit. We found that people, really need access to really great institutional deals. And, from high net worths and family offices, they just don't have very good access.
That's so true. I think that's a really good niche and approach to take, because if you look at the investing landscape, typically it's your Artemis, it's your Clarion, it's your Carlyle who have access to all
everything.
these. Blackstone.
It's like they have the capital,
They have the capital.
The deals flow to the capital.
So
if you can reposition that,
and offer it up.
And most of it's led with our personal cash, which is what deals do we want to be in? Yeah,
sure.
And so we do kind of a GP commit where we say we're going to be the first check in. And so we get aligned on any deals that we're doing, and then we syndicate around. And if our thesis is, if we like it and we're willing to write a check in it, that there's other people that see it the same way we see it.
Yeah.
And up until this point, we've been oversubscribed on every deal that we've done.
That's awesome.
And so, the feedback from the market is that people have the same needs that we have. People have the same tax needs. People have the same cash flow needs. If somebody wants a monthly check, I like a monthly check. I like, passive income. And somebody else probably likes that same thing. And so if I can find something that works for me, somebody else probably wants the same thing. And, what we found is that it's proved true that there is really good, there's a need in the market for it. And we feel like we're really good at filling the need.
So backing up to the mobile home operation, what years? So when did you leave Vivint, and then when did you start the mobile home piece?
Well, what's so interesting with Vivint is an extremely entrepreneurial culture. Like it's celebrated if you're out being entrepreneurial.
That's great.
Outside of just doing your job. And for me, I always thought that was normal. And the older I get, the more I realize it's not normal.
Yeah.
There's a lot of cultures that kind of discourage you from being entrepreneurial. They just want you to be like a really good lieutenant or a really good employee.
Exactly.
And that was never the culture at Vivint. It was, we were paid my whole career 100% variable comp.
Yeah.
So we always felt like we owned our own business within that business. And so we actually started, a company that buys restaurants and a company that did manufactured housing and invested in a bunch of other really great companies just along the way. So it was kind of a side hustle. And honestly, it was the reason we would celebrate that. And we would, that's how we would get people to come work with us, is we would say, you're going to use this vehicle to generate your capital, but this isn't an end game forever.
Yeah.
You're very similar to a professional athlete that has a skill set that's going to create a lot of capital, but you have a shorter life cycle. And so with that, you got to go put that money to work so that when that life cycle ends, you've got a nest egg that can go work for you for a long time. And we tried to live it, and I think that's why we were effective with it, and was because it was that for us. It wasn't lip service. We were really doing it. We were in, and so we started, Vineyards, which turned into Roots a couple years before we transitioned out of Vivint. And honestly, it was kind of the reason it made the transition really easy, because we already had something that had legs and was moving that kind of needed us outside of the company.
So I want to talk about your first deal with Vineyards and subsequently Roots, and then also with Sandlot, because I think for people who want to start an investment company, usually it's that first deal. Like how did you find the capital? How did you source the opportunity? So if you could dive into that, Casey, that'd be awesome. When you guys are at Vivint, you're contemplating this project or this deal.
Jeff Mendez and Jeff Bennett had gone out and bought a couple of communities. They bought 2 or 3 communities. And so they had been doing it. And I had invested with Lance and Colmena, and Brian Stevenson was Stoke Stevenson. And so I had been in, we'd done office buildings, we'd done industrial warehouse buildings, we'd done multifamily projects, and so for me, real estate was something that I just wanted to be deep in forever. And to this day, I'm overweighted in that asset class and like it. I love everything about real estate. But I didn't have any exposure to manufactured housing. It's a very niche industry. It's a very specialized industry. And so when Jeff kind of came to me and said, hey, this is what we're doing, I was like, yeah, I'd love to be an investor in that. So there was no intent to do anything other than just invest in a deal.
Got it.
And so we put up our own cash to buy those early communities. And pretty quickly we realized, hey, this is a bigger opportunity than our personal cash. Yeah. Our personal cash can get a couple of communities, but this is a platform. This is something that there's, 95% of the market is mom and pops. This is an industry ready to be rolled up. This is the last frontier of commercial real estate. And, and again, I had insecurities. I'm not a real estate professional. That's not my world. I'm a relationships and a sales guy. And so I needed kind of validation. So I took it to guys that I really respected as kind of professionals that had spent their whole life in real estate. Yeah. So I took it to, Stevenson's and Wadsworth's and Colmena, and I had invested with those guys on a really interesting project called the Northwest Quadrant. Yep. That's like kind of once in a generation type deal that we put some money in that's just been fantastic. So they were partners on that. So it was a really natural fit. And they had two partners, a guy named Greg Nielsen, who was a really exceptional operator. He's an attorney, and Jason Robbins that had managed the Woodbury Fund that they've done. Yeah. And so there was just kind of all of a sudden all these ingredients. Yeah. And so we went on a road trip. I remember we flew out to, South Texas. We got a van. It's all 8 of us in the car, and we just drove from community to community to community, and you'd see these communities that are half full. Mm-hmm. And then you'd see a second community that there's been some work in, and they're 70% full. Yeah. And then you see one that's fully stabilized, and you're like, the one that's fully stabilized looks exactly like the one that's half full, except for they just bought 100 more trailers, fixed up the clubhouse. Mm-hmm. But the one that's stabilized is worth 5 times as much. Yeah. And so the tax, the way that trailers are treated with tax, there's accelerated depreciation. You take the full offset up front, and so all of a sudden there's all these things. You're just like, this is crazy. Like this could be really big. And at that exact same time, they brought out these opportunity zones. Yep. And across the country, in every single state, they just kind of marked off big swaths of land that were opportunity zones. And the hurdle to meet with opportunity zones is you had to reinvest back into the sites, which we had to do anyway to go fix up these mom and pop trailer parks. Yeah. So it was like all these boxes just got checked. And so it felt like a very natural asset for it. And there was this huge demand, this tax demand from people exiting companies and real estate to be able to, get a tax efficient vehicle to do it. So just kind of the stars lined up. And so we, went out and did that. One of the biggest blessings, Bridge, who, big publicly traded Utah company now. Yep. They had told us, hey, we want $100 million in your opportunity zone fund. We'll write you a check for $100 million. Dang. And so we're like, well, it's a done deal. We got the cash in hand. Yeah. No super kidding. Naive. It's like, now I've heard anytime somebody says, I got to give you a big check, I'm like, discount it by 99%. Yeah. So I'm the most optimistic person ever, but with fundraising, you're skeptical until you're not. Yeah, exactly. So, anyway, it didn't pan out with Bridge. They never came with the capital. There was some, that fund didn't ramp the same way that I think they'd anticipated it ramping. Okay. So ultimately we had to front it. So there was this one moment of truth where we had this big portfolio. It was like a $40 or $50 million portfolfolio. And we had to go front it with our personal cash. And it was hey, this went from being interesting to we're fully committed. Yeah, no kidding. It's looking around the room and it's all of us saying are we do we really want to do this? Yeah. And that was kind of the turning point. We closed on that deal, and then, funding started coming in, and it just took off. And so cool. We're 4 or 5 years into it, really great management team now. A guy named Matt Matheson runs that company, and he's exceptional.
That's great. So now your role is more high level advisory kind of,
I have board seat, have my ownership, but it's just cheering for them for the most part.
That's great.
And it's super educational. You know, you have proximity to these phenomenal leaders that are excelling in their industry. And so part of it's just like, I feel really grateful to be there.
Cool. Yeah. So cool.
Got a seat in a cool room.
It's called Roots. That's the,
Roots Management.
Roots Management. That's so cool. No, I always love hearing the early days and how you guys started. So then transition to Sandlot. You guys started.
So Sandlot, same thing. Completely random. Dave Jensen moved home from the East Coast. Mm-hmm. He'd founded a company called Beacon Data. So it's a data and analytics company where they'd go in with, private equity firms, and they would help them kind of organize their data on portfolio companies that they'd purchased.
Okay.
And, we're having some success, but it's a service-based model. It's just a hard model, like it's very human activity based, a lot of work to go make that work. And so he was back. I think he was having some success with it. It was paying the bills, but I don't think it was ultimately like going to be his end all opportunity. And we just became friends. It was so fun. There's another guy named Jason White, who's really exceptional real estate guy. He manages all of Ryan Smith's real estate. He worked at Green Street.
Okay. Yeah.
Dave and Jason knew each other back in, New York. And so we have like a little private office that we, officed out of, and Jason had an office there, and Ryan did, and Todd did, and I did. And Dave was driving out to Kiln to like do, office sharing space.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, this office is right down the road from my house. He's like, hey, Jason, could I just like stop by there a couple days of the week? Mm-hmm. Jason's like, sure. And so I was like, literally, I'm like, Dave was at the office.
Yeah.
And I meet him and I'm like, hey, what's up? And he's like, hey, I'm just, officing out of here. And we kind of hit it off, and it was crazy that we didn't know each other. I've got 100 friends that knew him.
Sure.
And Dave was, All-American baseball player at BYU, went and played pro baseball for the Royals for 3 or 4 years. And,
nice.
But he was a couple years older than me, and so we just missed each other in Utah County. He left. But I had a lot of good friends that knew him.
Yeah.
And so it didn't take kind of too many calls to reference check that, hey, he's a good guy. And, and so we started hanging out. Our families are really similar. We both have 5 kids that are about the same age.
Nice.
And he ultimately introduced me to Dallas Tanner. Okay. Who ended up being we merged our company with him. And so there was, we were working on some things, and we're also looking for opportunities to work on things. And then COVID hit, and that summer was just insane. Like the world went nuts. Mm-hmm. Gyms are shutting down. Mm-hmm. I've got friends that think it's the apocalypse that's coming. They're like manning down the hatches on their house and, not looking out the windows. And, we never, I don't want to say we never took it that serious. I was just, we were just kind of like, we're not going to live in fear. And so we had a gym at our house, and ultimately like people started coming over to the gym. Uh-huh. And so Dave, started working out there every day. So we'd see each other, and it kind of worked up to this point where it's the end of the summer. And David Neilman, who was the founder and CEO of, Morris Air, JetBlue, Azul, TAP Air Portugal, kind of this legendary aviation entrepreneur, probably the most famous aviation entrepreneur, done it so many different times. And he was starting his company. He was starting Breeze Airways. Got it. But COVID literally knocked out like 90% of the market cap of all airlines. Yeah. And he had a big piece of his net worth. He was kind of pushing $1 billion net worth, and just had a lot of his net worth obliterated during COVID. Mm-hmm. Random. And so he went from he was going to fund the entire airline by himself, that he was going to go raise outside capital. Mm-hmm. And so Dave just kind of in a moment of, faith, he just said, I want to go do this. And so he approached Dave and got permission to go raise some capital. We held a meeting. Dave came and presented, and over the course of 3 or 4 weeks, Dave raised $50 million for this deal. And I think he ultimately got about 25 million. But that was kind of the first time where we realized, like, wow, if there's a really great deal, smart people are going to be able to understand it, and they'll write a check. And so Dave kind of came to me and said, hey, would you partner with me on this? And I saw it as an investment. I'm like, you're telling me I can like put in an investment, you'll go do all the work. And if we get another Breeze Airways, like we could do nothing for 5 years, but if we get one more of those deals, that'd be like the best investment I've ever done. So I'm like, yeah, for sure. And I had these other responsibilities, and it went from like kind of an opportunity that I was excited about to my career in 6 months. We went and did a joint venture with Pelion, and did a Series D for Divvy with Blake Murray and those guys. And then they end up going and selling to Bill.com 3 or 4 months later for a big number. And so
that's right.
That was a, kind of real fun joint venture. The Pelion guys are, we really like Blake and, Chad Packard and, those guys, they're really, great guys. And so we did that deal. And then we did a deal with a local energy group, Danny Gunnell and Kimball Hodges, called Wasatch Energy Management. And same thing, COVID, lots of pessimism in the market, oil prices had actually gone to zero. I don't even know how that's possible, but they've gone negative, which again, my simple brain doesn't understand how they can go negative, but they did. And so we got, sent this opportunity to go do this oil and gas deal, and we'd never done oil and gas. And so, but we start digging into it, and the way that they'd structured it was just this beautiful structure where there was really no downside risk. It was kind of, we're going to go get 2x our money, and then after that, we go split the upside 50-50.
Dang.
And this publicly traded company called Ovintiv, they had just acquired another regional company. So they had these leases that were going to expire if they didn't drill. But because of COVID, no one was drilling. Like, there was a lot of fear, no one was traveling. Gas had gone. So I think gas was $30 or $40, or oil was $30 or $40 at the time. Gas was like $2.50. And so we're sitting there like, and it, the world's ending, but we're like, the world's ending, but our break even $17.50 per barrel. And it's never been there like in the last 70 years. And if it goes up, it's all upside. And if it goes down, we basically break even, and there's a big tax write-off. And so when we actually like took the emotion out of it and just said the asymmetry on this deal is just crazy. There's very little downside, big tax write-off with like a lot of upside and quick capital return. And so we end up going and doing like 25 million bucks with them, and got smart on oil. And so now we've done, we partnered with Arch Energy, the group out of Dallas, and we've done 100+ million with those guys, and hundreds of millions in real estate with, different, a lot of the same operators that we did the mobile homes or, and then we do opportunistic kind of private equity. So when we see really cool private equity deals like Breeze Airways, we did another deal called Click Lease. There's a founder named Bart Longson that him and Matt Hawkins had founded this company called Snap Finance. And they're like best friends, for 20 plus years. They'd been business partners, done 3 or 4 different businesses. And Snap Finance was a big business. They'd taken money from Summit at a big valuation. I had Todd and Alex and Rick Stratford, these guys that invested in that company and made, probably pushing up to like 100x their money. Like it was like one of the best deals they'd ever done. And Bart was separating off from Snap to go do the same thing, except in the small and medium-sized business space. And so we looked at it, we're like, this one is 100xer, same founders, for the most part, same cap table, and they're on the front end. And so we're begging Bart to get in the deal. And at the front, he kind of said no. And then over time, they ended up letting us, We did $67 million in that deal. We're the only capital sponsor.
Wow.
And, you know, they're performing really well. They've got a great team, but those are kind of some examples of just, you know,
that's awesome.
Deals that we've done that started from very humble beginnings. You know, there was no like grand plan to go in finance or private equity or real estate or funds or any of it. It was just kind of the natural next step.
Right. Well, yeah, it speaks to relationships and just eyes open and pivoting and just being in the right place at the right time. And so are you guys investing? It's not a fund then, or is
funds.
it?
Yeah, we got 3 funds. We've got a real estate fund.
Okay.
We've got a blended fund that just has a little bit in everything we do.
Okay.
So the blended fund would be in oil and gas. It would be in private equity. It would be in real estate. It's kind of a blend of alternative assets.
Okay.
And then we have a private equity only fund. So we've got kind of specialized funds.
Yep.
Only real estate, only private equity, and a little bit of everything.
Okay.
And then on top of that, we'll have direct deals. And so like we're doing a deal with Colmena. It's a really cool project in Mesa, Arizona.
Industrial deal?
Industrial warehouse. Buying a ranch, 295 acre ranch, almost 5 million square feet of industrial.
Yeah.
Right on Power Road, like, you know, great deal, great cost basis.
Yeah.
And we're doing 50 million in that deal, 50 million of equity.
As like an SPV, separate vehicle.
We'll take a piece of it out of our funds.
Okay.
But from an allocation standpoint, it's too big for the funds.
It's pretty heavy. Yeah.
And so the surplus, what we can't do in the funds, we'll set up a separate SPV and go direct. And so
makes sense.
We try to, you know, think about it as saying like, how do we be a phenomenal partner to somebody, you know? And there's some groups that they don't want to be in funds. They just want to take a look at a direct deal. And if they love it, come in direct.
Yep.
Where there's other people that they don't want to do the underwriting on a deal by deal basis. They want to underwrite you as the manager.
Right.
When they get comfortable with you as the manager, they allocate to you as the manager. And you can allocate kind of over a lot of different assets. So that's kind of been the progression. And so much of it has been led by saying, you know, how do we be a better partner? So now we're a registered investment advisor. We're, you know, with the SEC.
Okay.
We're on the platforms. We're on Fidelity and TD and Schwab. Our funds are on there. And so, you know, it's allowed us to get access to different capital sources than just direct capital.
Yeah, I want to ask you, Casey, about raising capital specifically. So for us as a real estate operator and sponsor developer, I mean, the biggest focus for us is building investor relationships, you know, raising capital and then finding deals.
Yep.
You talked about RIAs, high net worth, family offices kind of being your sweet spot.
Yep.
So, and then I also see, so I follow you on Instagram and I see you reshare like, hey, someone opened up the Sandlot Partners like box and like, it seems like you have a lot of, you know, I guess retail investors as well. Some are sales guys or you know,
but they're all guys with, you know,
with cash, right? Yeah, with some money, right?
People who are investing with us, they have a net worth over $2.5 million.
Yeah.
So it's not like, you know, somebody that's never made money before, you know.
Sure.
If somebody's investing with us, but we see ourselves as a excellence obsessed, customer service focused organization that does investments and not the other way around.
Sure.
And I think most people look at it with a separate lens. They say we're an investment company, you know, that has investors, and we see it the opposite. We see it as we're a high-end customer service company that does investing.
I love it.
And that paradigm matters a lot because you do things differently that you wouldn't do otherwise. You know, if we're a customer service obsessed organization, then you'll send people handwritten notes on their birthday.
Right.
That you'll take the time to go answer their questions one-on-one. You'll like really put in the effort and energy to go educate and add value outside of financial returns. You know,
I love it.
The financial returns have got to be there. Just no one's going to invest with you. You have to have great
it's expected.
Deals. It's essential.
Yeah.
You don't have a company if you don't have solid financial returns.
Right.
But it's plain stakes. It's not the end all. There's a lot of companies that have great financial returns. And so you've got to have something that's differentiated. And you've got to have a reason why somebody would give you money and not the other 15 opportunities that have, you know, on paper, a similar return profile.
Right.
And so, you know, we think most of that has to do with, if, you know, and it's coming from a personal paradigm. It's like the companies that inspire me are the companies that have an emotional relationship with their customer.
Yeah.
You know, when I think about Apple, when I think about Nike, when I think about Lululemon, when I think about Porsche, when I think about Aman Resorts, when I think about, you know, these companies that are just known, you know, Virgin Galactic or Virgin brands in general, you'll have these founders that are just obsessed with delighting the customer and creating raving fans.
Yep.
And because of that, they, you know, when you think about Apple, Apple doesn't talk about the products that they make. They talk about like changing the world.
Yep.
And so people just have this affinity to Apple, and it also gives them a broad, you know, a broad landscape to work. They haven't pigeonholed themselves into this tight little niche. They actually have a lot of places they can go, and they've done it. You know, they went and took over the music industry. They're taking over the TV industry. They're getting into cars. They're getting into services. You know, Apple's taking over the world. But I think so much of that has to do with their vision of, you know, what they see themselves as, where if they would have said, we're a computer company.
Yep.
I think, you know, you don't get into music. You don't get into iPods. You don't get into phones if you're a computer company. That's not your identity. But they were able to establish, you know, we're about changing the world, and, you know, and it opens up opportunities to go pursue.
Yeah.
So for us with fundraising, it's that we want to be the best partner that anybody's ever had in their investing experience. And we think that has more to do with than just the investment. We also think the investments have to be world-class. The partners have to be world-class. The reporting has to be excellent. But more than that, like, people want to know that you know their situation, that you care about them, you know their name, you know their kids' names. And, you know, if you do that, what I've seen is you know, the reason I stay at certain resorts is because of the service.
Yeah.
It's not because the pillow's better. It's because they just make me feel really special. Yeah. So we try to make people feel really special. We try to do it from a place that's genuine and authentic.
I love it. And you guys do a great job with that. From what I've seen,
thank you.
It's top notch, and we're trying to do the same thing at Park West. I guess, speaking of fundraising, you know, for a group that's looking to raise capital.
Yep.
What advice would you give them? What strategies would you give them? Because for us, it seems like there's a few different routes you could take. If you look at guys like Grant Cardone, very much like, you know, advertisement focused, sponsored posts on Instagram, click here, become an investor, fill out this form, and just really go into the masses, right? And on the other side, you have groups. So it seems similar to you guys and other groups across the valley, where it's very much, let's go meet with this family office. Let's go build a relationship. Maybe we're not all over the internet, or maybe we're not, you know, I don't know. And so for us, we're trying to find that balance. It's like, do we go spend money on a Facebook ad to get in front of somebody,
or it's a compliance thing?
Yeah. For sure.
Like we're, you know, we're a registered investment advisor. So some of the strategy is dictated by what's, you know, what the SEC says we can and can't do.
Sure.
You know, and so, you know, I think that's part of it. What I've found is the questions you're asking may not be the right questions. You know, you kind of got to go more to the core of what are we and why are we doing it? Yeah. And if you can figure out the what and why, it feels like the how, you know, kind of takes care of itself. There's a million different hows. You could go through 1,000 different fundraising strategies on how to go get a deal done. You know, if you put a whiteboard together, the how, but you got to go kind of take a step further and just say, you know, what are we at our core? Yeah. And why are we that? Why are we, you know, and if you can really articulate that, then it's just marketing. Then you just got to tell your story. And, you know, you can tell it person by person, you know, you can tell it digitally. And again, compliance is a big issue. Like anytime you're raising capital, you're a steward over their capital, and you just got to be so careful, you know? Right. And so the second piece that I found is a great deal. Money finds great deals. Sure. So the best way to be exceptional fundraisers is just go do good deals. Yeah. Like if you can do good deals and tell the story in a simple way, I don't think you'll ever have a problem raising money. Yeah, I love it. Yeah. That's what I've seen. Yeah. Mediocre average deals and not telling your story properly, it gets harder. But I think step number one, like the reason we had so much success with Breeze, like we didn't have to do any work on that deal. David Neilman, people hear his story one time and they it's like fallen over themselves to invest. And the same with the Bart Longson and Click Lease, and the same with these Colmena deals, when you get Lance Bolin and Jonathan and Brian in front of the room and they tell their story about their track record, it's like, take my money. You know what I mean? Like, because they're good. They're really good, and they're experienced. They're professionals in it. And so I think those are the things that we found is you can underwrite a deal and then also just spell it out the most simple terms so that somebody knows, hey, I put in this, I get this, and this is when I get it.
Yep.
Like, this is what you get.
Yep.
And it's fair.
Yep.
They'll go do it, you know?
Yeah, I love it. That's great advice, Casey. Brand, story, finding great deals, and you'll have success.
Yeah.
I believe that. Well, last question, and we're wrapping up here. So you're famous for, and this is probably going to be the quick notes version of it, but your Sunday planning ritual. So this is a big shift here, but I would love to just give the Cliff Notes version of, you've posted on social media, people are reposting it every week about how important and that is to their week. Maybe walk us through quickly what you're doing on a weekly basis from a goal setting ritual.
I've been
Sunday
thinking
planning
about this a lot lately because, we went through this with our personal organization to go really figure out what we are, like who we are to our core, and why we are that, and so Sunday planning is a how. Like that's a mechanism, but I think the what is, I want to go build a deliberate, beautiful life. That's the what, that's the motivation, is I want to go have a marriage that's passionate and that we're in love when we're old. And I want to have kids that like each other and that they know that we love them and that we have community and that they're hard workers and that they contribute. And I want to be I want to have an unshakable financial foundation. And I want to have a relationship with God, like a real relationship with God. And I want to make an impact on the community. And I want to be in really good physical shape. I want to feel good. And I want to be growing, as a person. Yeah. So I think those are the what's, is like, what do I want? And it's like mentally, physically, social, emotionally, spiritually. I want to go have a top 1% life. I want to go find who's doing it at the highest level. And I want to model them. And why do I want it? Because like you got one life to live. Because money is a magnifier. Like money is just going to make you more of what you are. So if you're a bad person, it's going to just allow you to be worse, bigger. You know what I mean? Like you can just do more damage. And the same thing, like if you have a big heart and you want to go make a dent in the world and you want to give back, money is going to give you a bigger platform to go do that in a more meaningful way. And so I want to go make a ton of money so that I can go make a dent on the world. And so that's the why. Why do I want to, great physical health? Because I want to show up with the right energy. I want to be able to be physically active. I don't want to be a vegetable. I want to be active till the day that I die, so I got to go do the work. Yeah. Mentally, like I want to be a continuous learner. I want to be on my deathbed and still have a book open or like something that I'm noodling on. And most of it comes from the philosophy that fulfillment comes from two things, like being truly fulfilled. And for me, even like spirituality, like this is what my relationship with God consists of. It comes from personal growth. When I'm growing and I'm progressing, I'm happy. And when I'm serving in a big way, I'm happy. So that's the what and why. And I think getting that done first matters, because everybody goes to the how, which is like the mechanism to plan. But the reality is, if you don't have the top stuff done, you're going to like stop planning. Like you're not going to have the fire and the passion and the purpose to go do it. But once I get really honed in on the what and why, then, the mechanism or the how is I plan on a weekly basis. So I wake up early, I'll meditate. I've got kind of a little guided meditation that I do. I'll write these 3 questions, what gets me excited? Who am I? And what are my biggest opportunities? And I'll list the answer to these questions to kind of refresh my mind on the what and why. And then I'll write a 1-page summary. I've got a journal that if I could go back 20 years,
Wow.
and you could say, hey, 2012 in August this week, what were you doing? I could go back to that week and I could tell you this is what I'm doing. And I write just a 1-page summary of the week. What I do well, what didn't I do well, and just kind of hold myself accountable. And then I set goals for the next week. Kind of my big rocks or my most important things. And I'll have categories. So I've got, mental, I've got scholar, athlete, disciple of Christ, husband, dad, founder at Sandlot, business development. I'll have my different hats that I wear.
Yeah.
And then I ask the question, what's my biggest opportunity in this role? And I list 2 or 3 things, and I make sure that I get those in my schedule. And you can be extremely inefficient with your time and extremely effective in your life if you can just take that 20% of activities and make sure that it's on, your schedule. And even this interview falls in that plan, which is this for me is the spiritual piece. This is, how do I serve? How do I give back? How do I add value?
Yeah.
And that would fall in that category of one way that I can add value is I can let my light shine and share, the stuff that has been helpful for me.
Yeah.
So that if somebody else is like curious or, wants to learn, that hopefully like something that I share can help somebody that I'm not with them in person. And so it falls into kind of that disciple bucket for me. And so but then it gives me a framework when I go through the year of what I say yes to, or go through the week, and what I say no to. And I think the point is that good is the enemy to great, and that we say yes to good things when we haven't really dialed in the great things. And when we're crystal clear on what we want and what's really important, it allows us to say no to really good opportunities. And that's been my personal experience. That's, it's a work in progress. I'm always tweaking it. I'm always modifying it, but I hesitate to say, hey, this is kind of the plan for somebody, because my plan came from me, figuring it out, reading books on it, and, trying to put it together. But the outcome, it's the one habit that's add the most quality of life out of any other habit that I have in my life, kind of waking up early on a Sunday and going through that process.
Well, I appreciate you saying yes to this invitation. And
thanks for the invite.
Thank you so much for being here.
I'm cheering for you and your business.
Thank you.
I can't wait. It's fun to hear about your career at Morgan Stanley. It's fun to hear about kind of your institutional career in real estate.
Yep.
And it's, we're going to fast forward 5 or 10 years and you're like running this town. And so it's going to be,
that's the hope, something like that.
Don't forget the little guys, when you're out just running the show that,
well, thanks, Casey.
We're cheering for you all along the way.
Appreciate that a lot.
And I hope that this podcast allows you to go tell your story and to be able to raise capital in a way that, you can go start your career. All of us need somebody to believe in us early.
Yeah.
And bet on us early. Yep. And the reality is, if you guys do great deals, you're never going to have a problem having a lot of investors.
Yeah, that's the hope. Well, seriously, thanks for taking the time, Casey.
All right, brother. Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yep, we'll see ya.